So welcome to this session devoted to the idea of whether world trade can still play a pacifying role. For decades, we believed that globalization would be a good thing and would do lots of good things for different nations. But we're seeing more trade conflicts come back between the United States and China. There's the war in Ukraine. I'm going to introduce to you our speakers for this morning. Clarisse MAGNIN, who's the General Director of McKinsey France, Jean-Jacques Guiony, who is the CFO of LVMH, Pierre-André de CHALENDAR, President, CEO, and Honorary President of Saint-Gobain, and Sahar ALBAZAR. You are a Member of Parliament and Deputy Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee for the Egyptian Parliament. And then Hinda, who's just next to me, who comes from Bureau Veritas. I'm going to start straight away with you, Sahar, if that's okay. Can we have a headset, please, for Sahar ALBAZAR? I'll ask the question in English. I'm starting with you because you have to leave early. You have an aeroplane waiting for you.
The traffic in the Canal Suez is quite disturbed in the last month. Could you tell us what are the difficulties that is tensions, geopolitical tensions are posing to your country, and what does it mean for you for the trade and globally?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be among you today, and thank you for hosting me. And I'm so happy to be among this amazing lineup of panelists. So for the question of Suez Canal is important and vital globally and nationally. Globally, because 15% of the global trade ships, they pass through Suez Canal. And nationally, because it contributes to our GDP with around $10 billion annually, which is 2.3% of our GDP. The current situation is not the best, to be honest, and it's linked to peace, and it shows us the link between international trade and peace, whether regional or global. On the map, you can see Egypt is strategically located in the middle, and Suez Canal is linking Asia to Europe and also to Americas. So it's very vital. And what's happening now because of the war, and again, in the map, if you can see the borders, we have political instability in Libya, and we have civil war in Sudan, and on our right, we have the war between Israel and Gaza. And then the Houthis in Yemen, they keep attacking ships and blocking the sea, the Red Sea, which impacts the ships going through Suez Canal. What does that happen globally? What does that impact, and how does it impact the global trade and the national, on a national level? Globally, the ships have been dropped like almost 15%. Of the ships now, they started to reroute, and they take the longer route and not go through the Red Sea. Of course, they need to protect themselves against the attacks of Houthis. And what does that happen? What does that and how does that impact globally? First of all, it's not only the longer time for ships and deliveries. It's costly because it's longer, and for example, the ships from Singapore to northern Europe, it's now 70% more in greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see it's also impacting our climate. So again, we have to work on stabilizing the Red Sea, because of this global impacts. And on a national impact, as I mentioned, it contributes to our economy heavily. It's $10 billion per year, and it helps in creating jobs in Suez Canal, and it helps in having USD cash flow in the economy that we can use in our business and in trade. Again, what does that happen? and the impacts of it is, if that continues for longer time, we will have a lot of people out of jobs, and we will have instability in the economy. And it's not only locally, because we have refugees in our countries. We have refugees in our countries that also look for jobs. And the local Egyptian people who are looking for jobs, they will lose jobs. How this impacts Europe? Again, we will go back to the illegal immigration waves that have been happening until 2016. Waves from illegal immigrations from Egypt to Europe. Whether before it was coming from another African countries, going through Egypt to Europe, but now we will have it coming from Egypt to Europe. So thank God we didn't reach that situation yet, but definitely it's vital to stabilize the situation in the Red Sea, and Egypt chose to have the diplomatic tools and mediation to try to maintain the peace in the Red Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. I will come back to you in one moment. Pierre-Jacques, je vous donne la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Pierre-Jacques, you now have the floor. Thank you very much. Yes, it might seem strange to ask this question about world trade and peacemaking. We were in a hyper-globalized state with very dynamic trade, and that hasn't prevented the emergence of a very conflicting situation at world level with wars in Europe. So the link between trade and peace is more complex than we might imagine. And as we've heard from our colleague from Egypt, it works both ways. We need trade, we need peace for trade to work. So the question of this link between peace and trade has existed for a long time. We've had many debates between economists, historians, specialists of international affairs, and I would like to pay tribute to a colleague who left us too early, Philippe Martin from the Cercle des Économistes, who unfortunately left us in December, and he did work on the links between trade and peace. And with Thierry Maillet, they showed that the idea that trade promotes peace is only partially true. There's a distinction between bilateral trade and multilateral trade. When you're trading with one country, the interdependency is such that each depends on the other, and there's very little incentive to war with each other. When it's multilateral, you can be at war with a country because you have trade alternatives with the rest of the world. So there's a basic difference between something that's bilateral or regional, and when we have something that's more multilateral. The ability of Russia to get around any bans, for example, because of the invasion of Ukraine, confirms this interpretation. So this idea that trade strengthens peace goes back to Montesquieu. He said the effect of trade is on peace because two negotiators become dependent on each other. So interdependency is a rational factor of peace, and this corresponds to what Immanuel Kant was saying at the end of the 18th century. It also corresponds to what our Western countries have experienced, especially with European integration and globally since the end of the World War. And it's this interdependency which is also a source of vulnerability, which may be real or just perceived, and may also be a source of conflict. And this takes us back to the idea of dependency and vulnerability. Trade is not necessarily a factor of peace in this context. What we have to keep in mind is that politics are dominating. So economic interdependency, this idea overvalues economic rationality with respect to political autonomy. What I mean is that it's not just about the economy when you are at war. You are at war sometimes, even if the economic cost of war suggests a rational response, which is not to go to war. So this political dominance, we underestimate it, we forget it, we've experienced it in a period when we thought that the economy was autonomous, and it's really not the case, and that's what we're rediscovering today with the return of politics. And as the European experience shows us, we've got a European Union, but this union hasn't been translated into the creation of a political union. It's a kind of a political cooperation, but there are many things at stake that haven't been solved thanks to trade and economic cooperation. The second important idea is that this multilateral context that we have been seeing has become obsolete. And it's important to keep that idea of this framework in mind. It's not just trade that allowed us to enjoy decades of peace. It's the multilateral context in which trade was developed. It's not the trade itself. And so at the same time, you had the development of trade and peace, and that was a source of prosperity for our countries. And that period is behind us now. The third important idea is the importance of internal politics, domestic politics. So the trade system set up after the World War, why is it becoming obsolete? Well, it's because the world has changed, obviously, and that's an important reason. But these changes have increased the domestic conflicts and problems, and not just with respect to trade, but trade it goes hand in hand with a kind of propaganda, and that doesn't benefit everybody. There are winners and losers in trade. If we can't offset the losers, this creates social tensions, and they can be political tensions. What I mean by this is that accepting a multilateral framework for trade, and that's what we think of when we think of the prosperity. It depends on domestic politics. But today, domestic politics in many countries, including France, is marked by some considerable social tensions, making it very difficult to negotiate a multinational framework. To conclude, I'd like to say that we can't say that trade is a factor of peace. It's a factor of interdependency, and interdependency is a reality that is continuing. We can talk about deglobalization. We refer to the framework, but there's no decrease in interdependency. It's the political and institutional management of this interdependency at international level as well as at national level that is a factor of peace and prosperity. And that's the challenge that we have ahead of us. And we have to remember that it's not just about free trade. It's about regulating trade. It's about mutual recognition of differences and protection policies implemented by different countries. And that's the role of the World Trade Organization. And it's a role where we see constant negotiations about freeing up of trade in order to preserve the legitimacy of agreements and thinking having an impact on different groups. So it's the ability to manage politically interdependency with economic measures at these two levels, international and national, that is a factor of tensions and conflict. And so the responsibility of our leaders is at stake. Thank you very much for that. Pierre-Jacques has been talking to us about the role of politics. Sahar ALBAZAR.
What role can we play to have less confrontation between big blocs? We know that between the US and China, there's big commercial confrontation. What do you think? How can we be more peaceful?
So thank you for the question. Egypt usually diplomatically stands in an equal distance between all stakeholders and all countries, whether they are in competition or in conflict. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about whether geopolitics diplomacy or we're talking about trade diplomacy. We trade with everyone. We trade with the US, we trade with China, we trade with the Ukraine, we trade with Russia. So we definitely keep this mutual stance. We play different roles. We can play the mediator role by using our historical role of being the diplomatic player in the region in the Middle East to de-escalate the tensions that comes up every now and then in the Middle East, which impacts the global trade. And we play the role of strategic partner with international cooperations and international organizations, given our geographical location and our military capabilities, which helps normally in other situations in maintaining the peace in Red Sea and Bab el-Mandab. Definitely we also play a role in the environment part, because if we maintain peace in the Red Sea and ships decided to take the shorter route through Red Sea, not the longer one, will definitely contribute to the global change and minimize the gas emissions.
Thank you. Clarisse Magnin, je me tourne vers vous. McKinsey vient de publier un rapport.
McKinsey has just published a report about the new faces of globalization. It was published for the Rencontres Économiques DEX. It's about international cooperation. Are we seeing, do you think, a fragmentation of world trade? Giving the brilliant introduction by Pierre-Jacques, I was been wondering what I can possibly say, because he's summed up everything already. So perhaps very simply I can say this. Trade has a peacemaking role, that's the question, but my idea is no. And what about the increase in conflicts in the world? Is that having an impact on trade? The answer is no. That's my summary. So during the World Economic Forum, we publish a barometer of international cooperation that looks at 5 areas: world trade and capital flows, collaboration on the climate and the environment, 3, collaboration on innovation and technology, health and well-being, and 5, peace and safety in the world. So that's my answer in my introduction. So there's been an increase in international cooperation when it comes to trade. And over the past decade, there's been a considerable reduction in peace and safety across the world. And that's sad to see. It's being reflected in a number of indicators: who are the victims of wars and conflicts, the displaced populations, and then these cyber attacks that are another form of war affecting states, but also companies. So the correlation between the increase in world trade and peace, well, unfortunately, we cannot really confirm it. However, my idea, my theory is that this nevertheless affects international trade. And so this comes back to your question about, are we becoming regionalized or are we becoming deglobalized? What we're seeing is that during the Cold War, we had the Soviet Union and the United States. Today, we have 5 or 6 major zones of influence: the American influence, the Chinese influence, the Russian, Indian, Western Europe, and the rest of the world. And what's happening in terms of international trade? Well, we've measured whether trade between countries that are geopolitically close and friends, or who are distant, is it going up or down, that trade? We're seeing that the trade with non-aligned countries is going down, on average between 4 and 6%, except in the United States, where they've been more draconian. They've reduced their trade by 10% with non-aligned countries. China, for example, you've seen that there have been trade restrictions put in place. At world level, we've gone over from 650 to 3,000 in 2023. We've seen an increase in customs barriers between the United States and China. So they've reduced their Chinese imports by 9 points. That's huge, from 24 to 16%. So this has consequences. This has effects on the rest of world trade, because, the Americans, they've decided to increase trade with Mexico, geographically closer, and Vietnam. geopolitically close to them. And so the Chinese are losing out on part of their exports to the United States. So they've redeployed to the rest of the world.
And Europe, on its side, has remained very open. And since it's lost one of its main commercial partner, which was Russia, French turned to rather to the U.S. as instance, in fact, and some other countries, such as Germany, have turned to China. So Europe has remained a continent that is very open to the rest of the world. And to answer your question, is there a regionalization? The answer would be no. The multipolar world allows for everyone to have multiple partners. However, the element of war and tension, geopolitical tension, is affecting the world and is redefining all the flows, all the economic flows. Thank you very much. Jean-Jacques GUIONY, how do these commercial tensions that we're talking about since the beginning of the morning is affecting companies such as LVMH? You're at the forefront, aren't you? Yes, but as always, in theory, everything is simple at LVMH. If you look at the major production factors that affect us, we are regional integrators. We source leather, for example, in a tannery in the Limousin, a French region. We're going to assemble it in a different region of France, Loire-Atlantique or Creuse. So it's a regional actor in terms of production, which added value is not to aggregate components from diverse origin, but to do some local sourcing. And second of all, if you look at the competition in the luxury sector, if you take French and Italian companies, there's no real competition of currencies, which is often a very destabilizing factor in terms of world trade. So the products are from a constant origin, and we can imagine that all the countries receive them the same way. So we have a vision of globalization that is rather simplified. The reality may be a little bit more different. Without going back to what was said previously, but commercial strategies, aggressive strategic strategies exist. I'm not talking about dumping, but we're not far from it. Whether it's dumping with currencies, dumping with standards, these strategies exist. When they start to emerge, they create considerable tensions between various actors, world actors. And the best example that we have today is electric cars in the US and in Europe. The US decided to tax them, and Europe is looking into that as well. It probably has already made the decision. And the answer of the Chinese is to have an anti-dumping survey on cognac. We can see that there's a very close link between electric car and cognac. And what is the common point? It's us, because there's not that many exporters, and we export everywhere. So as soon as there is a problem in an international conflict, we are the ones who have to explain, negotiate, and say that our cognac is good, and Pernod Ricard and Rémy Martin are with us in this debate. But the industry, our industry is of size and nature, is not capable to fight in the same arena than electric cars. We don't have the same ambition. So we are very often the hostages of conflicts. We could see with the previous U.S. administration, that may be the future American administration. We found ourselves at the heart of conflicts that were a bit strange, with some risks, and with custom taxes that were asked for the producers of Roquefort. Well, if they put some taxes on customs tax on Roquefort, no Roquefort will be sold in the U.S. So we want to be a regional actor and still participate in globalization. And however, we can find ourselves hostages in conflict that have nothing to do with our activity and our business. Pierre-André, the CHALENDAR. How do you see tensions between the big countries weigh on your business? I want to say I love Pierre-Jacques' introduction, and he said many things much better than I would have, so I'm not going to repeat them. So I would like to complement a few points. I'd like to introduce an element that you just touched upon, is trade and peace. There's an element common to both, is growth and prosperity. And if you look at the world of economists, it's a topic where there's a link that always works. Trade is good for growth. Free trade is good for growth. The economic theory shows it, and practices has showed it as well. So I feel like we have a slowing down of global trade right now that leads to a slowdown of growth. This is a very important link. So, but if we talk about peace, peace is not about economies. So the link between growth and peace, if trade and growth work together, we have to, why isn't it linked to peace? Because peace is up to the political arena. And so we should, I want to make two other points. The cost of political tensions. I'm very struck to see that the attitude of the countries depend on how they're faring. I'm going to give you an example of two countries which are prone to say there's a problem. It's France and the US, two countries that have big commercial deficits, two countries that you could see in negotiation, or the first one to say we need to have more free trade is Germany and China. So if we manage to position ourselves well, and we need an interior policy, it's true, some countries are doing better than others. And thank God we have this luxury sector, but France is not just about luxury, so that's what explains all the problems that you may face. We have this attitude, generally speaking. The third point is when we talk it's the political that win, I agree with you, and if we read again the 50 last years, we could see that for a long period of time, you talked about the framework, but we had for a long period of time the Pax Americana, and the international framework, the WTO, Bretton Woods organization, they were held by Americans, and it was being reinforced after the years 90s with the explosion of global trade between the 90s and 22 is Pax Americana. And it's the American hegemony. What is being challenged today, much more than COVID and the war in Ukraine, is the rise of China, and it's the American-China rivalry. So that, and the Americans are looking at things differently, and trade, instead of being the common interest and the American interest to be a peace factor, trade today has become a tool of tension and a tool in the war. That's what sanctions are about. It's a hybrid tool now, trade, when in times of war. It's not good for growth, but unfortunately, we're looking at the political arena, and as we see it in many places, unfortunately, politics are not always rational. And to answer to what Jean-Jacques GUIONY said, that LVMH is always here when there's to be hostage in conflicts or to take a bullet. How do you escape that? Well, the answer that we have for the last 15, 20 years at Saint-Gobain, if that's your question, the answer of Saint-Gobain is not an answer that works for everyone. It was our way to address that. We are working on local markets, on local businesses where our products don't travel. So we reduce the geopolitical risk by working in just a limited number of countries, and we're not linked to these flows of trade. We are for some sourcing, for some, but if you are in the local markets, you escape these issues. So that's a good answer for Saint-Gobain, but it's not the right answer that we can have as a country. Thank you very much. Hinda GHARBI. Bureau Veritas has a particular story with globalization. Maybe you can explain that to us. What are the conditions, in your view, to do trade, to make of trade a pacifying method, tool? Hello, everyone, and thank you for this invitation. For me, I'd like to take a different stand than my friends at this round table. We need to put the human back at the heart of the discussion. I'm an industrial, I'm not a politician, so I'm going to have a hard time to discuss politics. But the human side of it, the communities and what's happening with trade is very important. Bureau Veritas is a company, bicentennial company that has had the opportunity and played a privileged role to see several industries in the whole world, in over 130 countries, and what gives us a good vision of what's happening in communities. Trade, I look at trade as a pacifying tool because it improves the livelihoods of the people in those communities. Of course, we can always say, well, there's exploitation, but the reality is there's some very good actors, there's some actors that are less good, but everything is going to be within the framework of the trade. How do you regulate trade to make sure that it benefits from all the communities everywhere in the world, not only economically, but on all aspects? We see it more and more with the improvement of practices. We see it in things as simple as road safety, education, health, and awareness of the choices that these populations may have. So for me, the pacifying aspect is this opening that global trade and trade in general brings into the communities. It's the opportunity for these communities to choose, to challenge the authorities by asking for better conditions. And if it is not at the macro level, it contributes to push towards more pacifying, more peaceful relationships. So, of course, the point that was made that was very important is that there's an interdependence that we could see every day. Be very important. We talk a lot about supply chain movements. It's not going to happen night and day. We can change a few things, but there's some skills and human capital at stake. I'm going to give you a very simple example. We talk about CHIPS Act. It's this law in the U.S. that gives big subsidies to build plants, manufacturing plants of electronic chips, but they are located in states where there's no qualified population, no technical schools. So the reality, there's an interdependence that makes states think about the political choices that they will have to make. And there's an improvement of the livelihoods and living conditions, which allows the populations to challenge the authorities. So maybe I'm in a different situation than my colleagues, but I don't think we should lose hope. When we think about trade, we have to support trade, and even, of course, it can be used as a weapon of war with sanctions and all that. But thank you. Thank you very much.
So we can trade more with friends. What's the consequence of reducing interdependencies? Well, I think it echoes what's already been said. You know, what are these interdependencies? I refer to them as essential resources, energies, minerals, and basic metals. And each region in the world, and to come back to what Hinda was saying, there isn't one region in the world that is not dependent of on at least another one with respect to 25% of its resources or goods or services that are essential. So we're all interdependent, but we're not all as interdependent as each other. The United States are not interdependent for energy or minerals. They're just a bit short of basic metals. In Europe, we are interdependent for the three: for energy, 50%, minerals, over 50%, and basic metals in a substantial manner. So perhaps I have this vision of that's a bit too negative, but you know, there are resources that are scarce. There will be other decarbonized solutions for energy in the future. But just to give you another example of a resource that we don't hear much about, food. The Middle East is 50% dependent on the supplies of cereals. So you can see the glass half full or half empty. These interdependencies mean that we must find, and as we heard from our colleague, we must find a way to interact with others. So civil societies are throwing out globalization. They're only seeing the negative effects. And I don't want to talk about political subjects, but you know, they're talking about purchasing power. And what is that? It's the cost of energy. This cost of energy, you know, I'm coming back to this. It's a reality. It's a problem. France has a lot of good energy resources, but fewer resources in other ways. So Europe is gaining in terms of exporting. So the commercial balance in France has been negative for over 15 years. So these are complicated subjects. There's no easy answer. But if we can better understand these macroeconomic mechanisms, I think we can probably find more cooperation solutions. And the last point, this is what Pierre-André was saying. You're right about globalization and international cooperation. It's started stagnating in 2020, so it's been 4 years now. Even if there's been a global increase in trade, we've reached a kind of plateau. And so perhaps, yes, you know, correlation doesn't mean causality, but perhaps the problems of peace and safety and economic wars are affecting growth that leads to prosperity, etc. Yes, so how can Europe go about managing these economic wars between the United States and China? Do we have a role to play, Pierre-André de CHALENDAR? Let me just go back over history. We heard about Montesquieu, but the best illustration is Jean Monnet and the father of Europe. And that is the European coal and steel community. Inside Europe, it worked. And then there was the Americana Pact. But I'm just talking about Europe, which is a great example. So the subject today is not inside Europe, even if, as Clarisse said, even if the benefits of the common market have to be underlined for general public opinion. The result of Brexit speaks words on the matter. So today, with the end of the American hegemony and the relations between the United States and China, how can Europe be positioned? Europe is the last place where we want to claim that we have an older system based on multilateralism. So we've never positioned ourselves as a geopolitical power. So what should we be doing? I think four things are needed. First of all, we have to continue to recommend multilateralism. We mustn't align with American positions. I think that's very important. Even if we're the only ones who continue to talk about multi-services, but we mustn't be the village idiot either. And that's the way Europe is seen sometimes. So this means going back to reciprocal rules with respect to customs tariffs. We have to have something that's reciprocal with respect to customs tariffs, but also with respect to foreign investments and also with respect to access to public contracts. The third point, and Clarisse mentioned this, is that taking into account the high dependency of Europe in certain areas, we must try and reduce our dependency on a certain number of materials that are critical. The Critical Materials Act was a start, but we must continue in that direction. The fourth point is that we've got to be better in-house. In other words, when we look at what the Americans are doing with Iraq, when we see the Chinese policies today, we need an industrial policy that is European so that we can boost competitiveness. We've got to be good inside of Europe. But this means a slight change. It means building a European vision, a geopolitical vision, and we're not there yet. Thank you very much, Jean-Jacques GUIONY. So your opinion on the subject? So we don't want any trade wars in Europe, do we? Well, the answer is in the question, if you ask it this way. It's an eminently political subject, and it's also ambiguous in the sense that, moving towards a trade war from a political point of view is bad for the economy, it's bad for politics, but having a martial posture, that can have an impact on politics. So it's very ambiguous, this topic. When you accept that ambiguity, which doesn't help us with the solution, it means that you have to come back to fundamentals. It's important for Europe to exist as Europe. It mustn't be the hostage of trade wars. When somebody starts to say that there might be a problem with Europe, we need to underline the interests of exporters, as part of LVMH. I know what I'm talking about. We mustn't cede to immediate trade interests because long-term interests are important too. I think in the long term, we don't want to weaken European companies. So this means there will be times when there will be tension. Look at China and electric cars. Look at the customs tariffs in the United States with respect to these products. So there's an increased tension between China and the European states. Europe is threatening of doing the same thing. We're doing surveys, investigations. I talked about cognac earlier on, but there are other investigations being carried out in China. China is saying to itself, Europe is a weaker actor politically, geopolitically, but also economically. And Europe is divided, However, we might talk about the success of Europe, which is undeniable, but we mustn't be, the broken arm. We've got to define the conditions for the success of Europe in international trade. Thank you. Hinda, what do you think about these subjects? Well, I would like to come back to two things that are lacking today when it comes to this subject in particular. Innovation, and that's very important. We're not hearing about it. Innovation means that we will not be fragmented. Trade needs innovation, and we're seeing this increasingly in all discussions on artificial intelligence. But the real subject, the real point is that we're changing quickly, and so we will need worldwide skills. So innovation is another vector, as far as I'm concerned, that should have a pacifying role, but we're in a very transitional and young phase for the moment. We don't yet have the framework in order to develop innovation. But perhaps I can come back to the subject of supply chains, because it is a question of supply chains. And how are they going to change? And the example of the electric vehicle is very interesting. Today, we have tariffs in the United States and Europe. The reality is that we work with Chinese producers, but, they're doing things in Mexico. They're setting up their ramparts in that country. There's such an interdependency in these supply chains that the main stakeholders will move and follow politics and make sure that they can serve the markets that are of interest for them. So whether we're talking about the Chinese government or other governments, we have to make do with the reality of these economic actors because they can't do without certain markets. We're observing this. We are there as a watchdog, but we can't imagine a world that is highly fragmented. So I remain very positive. Jean-Jacques Guiony, I'm coming back to you. So we've talked about the benefits of globalization. Is it they're being contested today? Should we be pursuing free trade at the moment? What is the French position? So it's the worst and best of everything in economics. At European level, you've got two visions. You've got the Ricardian vision that says trade strengthens global added value for the whole economy. So trade is good for everybody, and it creates interaction. So it paves the way for peace. So this is what Ricardo said. In the European Union, there's a second school of thought, which is much more focused on normalization, standardization. In Europe, we have to set an example at all levels, and we have to provide European consumers that are covered by these standards. So these two visions are a little bit conflictual and a little bit contradictory, especially when it comes to free trade agreements. When we think about the Mercosur free trade agreement where you've got quotas, I'm a bit surprised. Either it's good and we don't need quotas because, as the Anglo-Saxons say, we're on a level playing field and we don't really need to protect companies. But if we set quotas, it means that the competition is not equivalent. So how can you get public opinion to accept that kind of thing? Because, you know, everything is political. How can we get public opinion to accept certain things in agriculture as well? You know, okay, we've got quotas in the free trade agreement, but they're probably imbalanced because otherwise we wouldn't need these quotas. So for me, this is a problematic solution. Hinda, GHARBI, let me come back to you. So the growth of ESG criteria, there's a basic trend here. Is this changing trade at world level? So this is what I was saying to begin with. The improvement in living conditions means an economic improvement, but it also means very specific frameworks for the environment and for the adoption of social and governance practices. And I think that without, you know, getting involved in systems that are too rigid, this is something that concerns all stakeholders across the world. This is something that wasn't very well defined in the past, but I think it can certainly help us to improve dynamics of economic stakeholders in several countries across the world. And I think it can also contribute to pacification, but it's positive in any case. Clarisse Magnat. So consumers, we've talked a lot about the role of politics, but what about consumers? So that's a vast subject. Consumers, we are seeing, can adopt boycott positions. They can boycott products, depending on who is manufacturing a product or supplying a service. So there's a certain level of sensitivity in citizens and consumers to geopolitical issues, to the question of social dumping. This is what we've seen in studies, what consumers say. They're ready to pay more for practices that are more virtuous. But, you know, when the economy is not doing so well, you know, the message is not really reflected in reality. So, in spite of what people say. So, beyond consumers and their purchasing behavior, the real subject is public opinion. How do you kit out citizens so that they can form an opinion of these topics and have something to say and feel that what is happening is fair. So if I hadn't drawn up my report with my colleague, Mathieu Paca, I don't know whether he's in the room, we spent perhaps 6 months together looking through everything, going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. So we're educated, we work in business, we work for company heads. We wanted to understand what was happening, whereabouts we were going, how we might expect a citizen, a normal citizen, to understand these challenges. So it's a real question of education, of popularizing complex phenomena to make it possible to then guide choices so that people make the right choices. So if it's just among ourselves, among politicians, we're not going to get other people on board, the ordinary people on board. So this point of view will be highly isolated. And that's why, it's good to come to Aix, to the Rencontres Économiques, to look at the genesis of diversity, so to see, how we can disagree and discuss and move forward, find the right solutions for our Earth, let's say. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. Pierre-Jacques, you have the floor for the conclusion. Yes, I'd just like to take away 5 messages from this panel discussion. The first is the essential reality of interdependency, not just the conventional kind of interdependency that we've experienced, but there are 2 things that were mentioned that seem to be central. Innovation, that is a dimension. We've seen it with the COVID crisis, this interdependency that was necessary. But there's the economic of public goods. If we think about the fight against climate change, protection of biodiversity, these are things today that are really interdependent. Why? Because the solution could only be a collective solution. And I think that this is a very important point that makes us all mutually dependent on each other. And this can be conflictual, especially when it comes to relations between the North and the South. The second point that I'd like to point out is to put human beings at the center of discussions, even when we talk about growth. And I can only be in agreement with what you've said. The problem is, who is benefiting from growth? Who is reaping the benefits? I think human beings are at the heart of the objective of the economy, of trade. And if we can't set up the link, we're losing the ability to go into trade properly. And we mustn't lose sight of that. The third point, how can we organize multilateralism and this multilateral framework? We've got to have major countries inside that framework today. How do we negotiate with them? They don't have the same system of values. How do we go back to the negotiating table with them? This is a high level of politics. It's not about negotiating just trade policies. It's about negotiating mutual recognition of values. And I can see that time is ticking, so let me speed up. Fourth important point. In order to benefit from trade, we have to be strong. I think that several members of the panel mentioned this. We have to be strong, but not just from an economic point of view, not just from the point of view of international competition. We don't want to accuse foreigners, and I'm not linking things up with the political debate in France at the moment. We're going to be accusing globalization. That would be a mistake, because the problems of our country do not come from globalization. They come from our country. So being strong is about managing one's own problems without taking foreigners for scapegoats. Now, there are limits to this. There's an American philosopher, William James, who at the start of the 19th century, or the start of the 20th century, who said that war and having an enemy was a factor of social consensus, and that's what we're seeing every day. And he asked a question for which there's no answer. What is the moral equivalent of war? And I think that our discussion, is about that. And then the last point, and then I will finish with the question, is trade a factor of peace? Well, it goes both ways. So what's interesting for us is how can we have a virtuous circle between peace and trade like we had during the 30 years after the war? Thank you very much.